Jeremy Adams sat across from Thomas Rodriguez in the small coffee shop they had been meeting at for months, his hands wrapped around his mug like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The question hung in the air between them. The same question Jeremy had been asking for weeks now, always with that particular intensity in his dark eyes that made Thomas's heart race in ways he tried desperately to ignore. "So what do you think makes someone really fall in love?" Jeremy asked, his voice soft but weighted with something Thomas couldn't quite name. Like genuinely deeply in love, not just attracted or infatuated. Thomas felt that familiar twist in his chest, the one that had become his constant companion ever since Jeremy started coming to him with these questions about love and relationships. Jeremy's girlfriend, Emma, had broken up with him 2 months ago, and ever since then, these conversations had become their routine. Jeremy would ask about love, about connection, about what it meant to really know someone, and Thomas would offer his thoughts while trying to ignore the way Jeremy's eyes seemed to search his face for something more than just friendly advice. "I think," Thomas said carefully, setting down his coffee cup, "real love is when someone sees all of you, even the parts you try to hide, and chooses to stay anyway." Jeremy nodded slowly, but his gaze never left Thomas's face. "And how do you know when you have found that?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow, because the truth was, he thought he might know exactly what that felt like. He thought he might have been feeling it every time Jeremy looked at him like this, every time they talked until 3 in the morning about everything and nothing, every time Jeremy's laugh made Thomas's entire world feel brighter. But Jeremy was straight. Jeremy had always been straight, had dated women exclusively for as long as Thomas had known him. These questions weren't about Thomas. They couldn't be. Jeremy was just processing his breakup, trying to understand what had gone wrong with Emma, trying to figure out what he wanted in his next relationship. "You just know," Thomas said quietly. "It feels like coming home." Something flickered across Jeremy's expression, something that made Thomas's breath catch. But before he could analyze it further, Jeremy was looking away, running a hand through his dark hair in that gesture Thomas had memorized. "Emma said something before we broke up," Jeremy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said I never looked at her the way I look at my friends. She said I was holding back, like I was waiting for something else." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. "What did you tell her?" "I told her she was wrong," Jeremy said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "But lately I keep thinking about it, about whether she might have been right." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. Thomas could feel sweat gathering at the base of his neck, could feel the familiar panic rising in his chest. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could shatter the careful balance they had maintained for months. "Maybe you just weren't compatible," Thomas offered, his voice strained. "That doesn't mean anything was wrong with how you felt about her." Jeremy's eyes found his again, and this time Thomas couldn't look away. "But what if something was wrong? What if I've been looking for love in all the wrong places?" Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The question hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, and Thomas felt his world tilt slightly on its axis. Because the way Jeremy was looking at him now, the intensity and vulnerability in his expression, suggested that maybe, just maybe, these questions weren't as hypothetical as Thomas had assumed. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, this precipice of possibility and terror, Thomas would have to go back to the beginning, to the night 3 months earlier when Jeremy had first started asking these questions. It had been a Thursday evening in late October when Jeremy showed up at Thomas's apartment unannounced, his eyes red-rimmed and his usual easy smile nowhere to be found. Thomas had opened the door to find his best friend of 5 years standing in the hallway, looking more lost than Thomas had ever seen him. "Emma and I broke up," Jeremy had said without preamble, and Thomas had felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, a mixture of sympathy for his friend's pain and something else he didn't want to examine too closely. "Come in," Thomas had said, stepping aside to let Jeremy into the small one-bedroom apartment they had helped each other move into after college. "What happened?" Jeremy had collapsed onto the familiar brown couch, the one they had bought together at a thrift store during their senior year, and buried his face in his hands. "She said I wasn't really there, that I was going through the motions but never actually present." Thomas had settled beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to maintain the careful distance he had been preserving for months. That doesn't sound like you. You're one of the most attentive people I know. That's what I thought, Jeremy had said, looking up with confusion written across his features. But she kept saying there was something missing, like I was holding back some part of myself. She said it felt like I was performing the role of boyfriend instead of actually being one. The words had hit Thomas with unexpected force because he thought he understood exactly what Emma meant. He had watched Jeremy in relationships before, had seen the way his friends seemed to approach romantic connections with a kind of determined effort that never quite looked natural. Thomas had always attributed it to Jeremy being cautious, maybe a little guarded after his parents' messy divorce, but now he wondered if there had been something else underneath. Maybe you just weren't right for each other, Thomas had offered, the same platitude he would repeat in the coffee shop months later, but Jeremy had shaken his head. It wasn't just Emma. It's been every relationship I've ever had. Sarah, Christina, Ashley, all of them. They all said variations of the same thing, eventually, that I was distant, that I seemed to be somewhere else, that they never felt like they really had me. Thomas had felt something cold settle in his stomach. What are you saying? I don't know, Jeremy had admitted, and his voice had been so small, so uncertain. I thought I knew what I wanted, who I was, but maybe I've been wrong about everything. That night had been the first time Jeremy had asked him about love, about what it meant to really connect with someone, about how you knew when you had found the right person. Thomas had answered as best he could, drawing on his own limited experience and the romance novels he secretly read when he couldn't sleep, but all the while he had been acutely aware of Jeremy's eyes on his face, searching for something Thomas was afraid to name. The questions had continued over the following weeks, becoming a regular part of their friendship in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. Jeremy would come over after work, or they would meet for coffee, or they would talk late into the night over takeout, and somehow the conversation would always drift back to love and connection and what it meant to really know someone. Do you think some people are just built differently? Jeremy had asked one evening in November, as they sat on Thomas's couch, sharing a pizza and watching a movie neither of them was really paying attention to. Like, maybe some people experience attraction differently than others? Thomas had nearly choked on his beer. What do you mean? I don't know, Jeremy had said, but there had been something deliberate about his casualness. I've been reading about it online, about how some people don't realize they're gay or bisexual until later in life, because they've been trying to fit into expectations that never really worked for them. The words had hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Thomas had felt his heart start to race, had felt hope and terror warring in his chest. That's definitely possible, he had managed to say, his voice carefully neutral. People figure themselves out at different paces. Jeremy had nodded, but his eyes had been fixed on Thomas's face with that same searching intensity. Have you ever wondered about that? About yourself, I mean? The question had been like a knife turning in Thomas's chest, because of course he had wondered. He had known actually since he was 16 and realized that the feelings he had for his male friends were different from what his peers seemed to experience. He had known when he looked at Jeremy for the first time during their freshman orientation and felt something click into place that he had never felt with any of the girls he had dated in high school. But Jeremy didn't know that. Jeremy had never known that because Thomas had gotten very good at hiding, at playing the role of the supportive straight friend who was just unlucky in love. I think everyone questions things sometimes, Thomas had said carefully. It's normal to wonder. Jeremy had nodded again, but something in his expression had shifted, become more thoughtful. Emma asked me once if I'd ever been attracted to men. I told her no, but I've been thinking about it since we broke up, and I'm not sure that was entirely true. Thomas had felt the world tilt beneath him. What do you mean? I mean, I've never been attracted to men the way I thought I was supposed to be attracted to women, Jeremy had said slowly, as if he was working through the thought as he spoke. But there have been times with certain friends where I felt something different, something deeper than just friendship, but I always told myself it was just really caring about someone. The movie had continued playing in the background, but Thomas had been completely focused on Jeremy's words, on the careful way he was choosing them, on the vulnerability in his voice. That makes sense, Thomas had said, though his own voice had sounded strange to his ears. Sometimes the lines between different types of caring can be blurry. Yeah, Jeremy had agreed, but then he had looked directly at Thomas, and there had been something in his eyes that made Thomas's breath catch. Sometimes I think the clearest I've ever felt about caring for someone is with you. The admission had hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric. Thomas had felt his entire body go still, had felt his heart stop and then start again at double speed, because there had been something in Jeremy's voice, in the way he was looking at Thomas, that suggested this wasn't just about friendship anymore. Jeremy, Thomas had started, but he hadn't known how to finish the sentence. How do you respond when your best friend, the person you've been secretly in love with for years, might be suggesting that he feels something too? I know it's weird, Jeremy had said quickly, misreading Thomas's hesitation. I know you probably think I'm just confused because of the breakup, and maybe I am, but I can't stop thinking about it, about us, and how easy everything is with you, and how I never feel like I'm performing when we're together. Thomas had wanted to reach out, to close the space between them on the couch, to tell Jeremy that he understood exactly what he meant because Thomas had been feeling the same thing for years. But fear had kept him frozen. The same fear that had kept him silent all this time. You're not weird, Thomas had managed to say. You're just figuring things out. Oh, okay. Jeremy had smiled then, soft and grateful, and Thomas had felt something in his chest crack open. You always know what to say. That's one of the things I love about you. Love. The word had echoed in Thomas's mind long after Jeremy had gone home that night. Long after Thomas had lain awake staring at the ceiling and trying to parse the difference between loving someone as a friend and being in love with them. Because the truth was, Thomas thought he might know the difference better than anyone. The conversations had continued through November and into December, each one pushing them closer to some invisible line that Thomas was both desperate to cross and terrified to acknowledge. Jeremy had started staying later when he came over, had started sitting closer on the couch, had started touching Thomas more casually, a hand on his shoulder, fingers brushing when they passed each other food, hugs that lasted just a beat longer than they used to. I've been thinking about what you said, Jeremy had told him one evening in mid-December, as they sat at Thomas's small kitchen table sharing Chinese takeout, about real love being when someone sees all of you and chooses to stay. Thomas had looked up from his low moan, heart already starting to race at the serious tone in Jeremy's voice. Yeah, I think that's what I've been missing, Jeremy had said, his dark eyes intense in the warm light from the overhead fixture. I think I've been so focused on trying to be what I thought I was supposed to be that I never let anyone actually see me. The real me. What do you think the real you looks like? Thomas had asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Jeremy had been quiet for a long moment, twirling noodles around his chopsticks without eating them. I think the real me might be braver than I've been. I think the real me might be willing to admit when I feel something, even if it's scary or unexpected. The words had felt loaded with meaning, and Thomas had felt his pulse quicken. That sounds like a good thing. I hope so, Jeremy had said, and then he had looked directly at Thomas with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined, because I think the real me might be falling in love with my best friend. The confession had hit Thomas like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and making the small kitchen feel like it was spinning around them. He had stared at Jeremy, searching his face for any sign that this was a joke or a misunderstanding, but there had been nothing but sincerity and fear and hope in Jeremy's expression. Jeremy, Thomas had whispered, and his voice had been rough with emotion. I know it's complicated, Jeremy had said quickly, the words tumbling out like he had been holding them back for weeks. I know I'm probably not what you're looking for, and I know I'm still figuring myself out, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship. It's more than that. It's been more than that for months, and I think maybe it always has been. Thomas had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, had felt years of careful control crumbling in the face of Jeremy's honesty. You have no idea how long I've wanted to hear you say that. Jeremy's eyes had widened. What? I've been in love with you since sophomore year, Thomas had admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I've been sitting here for months listening to you ask about love and connection. And the whole time I wanted to tell you that I already knew what that felt like because I felt it every time I looked at you. The silence that had followed had been deafening, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside. Jeremy had stared at Thomas like he was seeing him for the first time, his expression cycling through surprise and wonder and something that looked like relief. 2 years? Jeremy had asked softly. 2 years and 4 months, Thomas had corrected, and Jeremy had laughed, a sound that was half sob and half joy. God, we're both idiots, Jeremy had said, and then he had been moving around the table, reaching for Thomas with hands that trembled slightly. Can I kiss you? Thomas had nodded, not trusting his voice, and then Jeremy's hands had been cupping his face and Jeremy's lips had been against his, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss had been tentative at first, questioning, but when Thomas had kissed back with years of pent-up longing, it had deepened into something desperate and sure. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Jeremy had rested his forehead against Thomas's and smiled. That felt like coming home. The weeks that had followed had been a blur of discovery and adjustment, of learning how to be together in this new way while navigating the fears and uncertainties that came with such a fundamental shift in their relationship. Jeremy had been patient with his own learning curve, asking questions about everything from how to tell his family to whether he should consider himself gay or bisexual. And Thomas had been there for all of it, grateful beyond words to finally be able to love Jeremy openly. They had decided to take things slowly, to give Jeremy time to adjust to this new understanding of himself, while they figured out how to be together. But slowly had proven to be relative, when every conversation felt charged with new meaning, when every casual touch sent electricity through both of them, when they kept finding excuses to be closer to each other. I think I need to tell my parents, Jeremy had said one evening in January, as they lay tangled together on Thomas's couch, watching snow fall outside the window. About us, about me figuring this out. Thomas had felt Jeremy tense against him and had tightened his arms around his boyfriend, still marveling at the fact that he could think of Jeremy that way now. How do you think they'll react? I don't know, Jeremy had admitted. They've always been pretty progressive, but this is different when it's your own kid, you know? Plus, they loved Emma. They're probably expecting me to find another girlfriend and settle down. They love you, Thomas had reminded him gently. That's what matters. The rest they'll figure out. Jeremy had turned in Thomas's arms to look at him, his expression soft with affection. How did I get so lucky to have you? I ask myself the same question every day, Thomas had said, and Jeremy had kissed him then, slow and sweet and full of promise. The conversation with Jeremy's parents had gone better than expected. His mother had cried, but from happiness rather than disappointment, telling Jeremy that she just wanted him to be happy and that she had always liked Thomas. His father had been quieter but supportive, asking thoughtful questions about how long Jeremy had been questioning his sexuality and whether he felt comfortable with his identity now. They want to have you over for dinner next weekend, Jeremy had told Thomas afterward, grinning widely. Mom specifically requested that you bring that pasta salad she likes. I can do that, Thomas had said, feeling overwhelmed by the acceptance and inclusion. His own parents had known about his sexuality since college, but they lived across the country and had never been particularly involved in his dating life. The idea of being welcomed into Jeremy's family, of being seen as a real part of Jeremy's life, had been more meaningful than he could express. The dinner had been wonderful, warm and comfortable in a way that had surprised Thomas. Jeremy's parents had asked about their relationship with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, and by the end of the evening, Thomas had felt like he truly belonged there. See, Jeremy had said as they drove home, reaching over to take Thomas's hand, I told you they'd love you. I think your mom might love me more than she loves you, Thomas had teased, and Jeremy had laughed. She definitely does. She kept asking me why it took me so long to figure out that you were perfect for me. And what did you tell her? Jeremy had squeezed Thomas's hand, his expression growing serious. I told her that sometimes the most important things are right in front of you, but you have to be ready to see them. Spring had arrived with a sense of renewal and possibility, and with it had come new challenges and joys. Jeremy had started coming out to more of their friends, most of whom had been supportive, and several of whom had admitted they had suspected something between Jeremy and Thomas for years. Aaron said he's been waiting for us to get together since junior year, Jeremy had reported after a night out with their college friend group. Apparently, we were not as subtle as we thought we were. What do you mean? Thomas had asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew. He said you used to look at me like I hung the moon, and I used to find excuses to touch you or sit next to you. He said it was painful to watch sometimes because it was so obvious that we both felt something but were too scared to do anything about it. Thomas had groaned, burying his face in his hands. I thought I was being so careful. We both were, Jeremy had said, settling beside him on the couch and pulling Thomas's hands away from his face. But I'm glad we're not being careful anymore. The transition hadn't been without its difficulties. Jeremy had struggled sometimes with the weight of redefining his entire understanding of his sexuality and attraction, and there had been moments when the fear of judgment or change had made him withdraw. Thomas had learned to recognize these moments, to give Jeremy space when he needed it while making sure he knew that Thomas wasn't going anywhere. Sometimes I worry that I'm not good at this, Jeremy had confessed one evening in April, after a particularly difficult day at work where a colleague had made some casually homophobic comments that had clearly affected him. Like, what if I'm not actually gay or bisexual? What if I'm just confused and I end up hurting you? Thomas had set aside the book he had been reading and turned to face Jeremy fully, recognizing the spiral of self-doubt that had become familiar over the past few months. Do you think you are confused about how you feel about me? No, Jeremy had said immediately. I know exactly how I feel about you. I love you. I'm in love with you. I want to build a life with you. That part I'm sure about. Then that's what matters, Thomas had said gently. Labels are just words, Jeremy. They're supposed to help us understand ourselves, not define us. If calling yourself bisexual feels right, then that's what you are. If it doesn't, then we'll find a different word or no word at all. What matters is that you know what you want. Jeremy had been quiet for a long moment, processing Thomas's words. I do know what I want. I want you, and I want this, and I want to stop being afraid of what other people might think about it. That sounds like a pretty clear answer to me, Thomas had said, and Jeremy had smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I love how you always know exactly what to say to make me feel better, Jeremy had said, moving closer on the couch until he could rest his head on Thomas's shoulder. It's like you can see right into my head and know exactly what I need to hear. I love you, Thomas had said simply. That makes it easy to know what you need. By summer, they had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. Jeremy had grown more comfortable with his identity and their relationship, and Thomas had learned to trust that Jeremy's feelings were real and lasting, not just a phase or a reaction to his breakup with Emma. They had started making plans for the future, talking about moving in together officially, about trips they wanted to take, about the life they wanted to build. I want to get a place with a bigger kitchen, Jeremy had said one evening in July, as they attempted to cook dinner together in Thomas's tiny galley kitchen and kept bumping into each other. Somewhere we can actually move around without constantly being in each other's way. I like being in your way, Thomas had said, wrapping his arms around Jeremy from behind and nuzzling his neck. But a bigger kitchen would be nice. They had spent the following weekend apartment hunting, looking at places that could be theirs rather than just Thomas's or just Jeremy's. It had felt significant, this step toward building something together, toward creating a space that reflected both of them. What about this one? Jeremy had asked, standing in the middle of a sunny one-bedroom with large windows and a kitchen island. It's got good light, and we could fit a bigger couch in the living room. Thomas had looked around the space, imagining their furniture arranged there, imagining lazy Sunday mornings and dinner parties with friends, imagining a future that felt solid and real. I love it. Yeah? Jeremy had grinned, looking pleased. You're not just saying that? I'm not just saying that, Thomas had assured him. I think this could be perfect for us. They had signed the lease that afternoon, giddy with excitement and possibility. Moving in together had felt like another milestone, another step toward the life they were building together. The actual move had been chaotic but fun, with help from their friends and Jeremy's parents, who had insisted on providing pizza and beer for everyone. Thomas had watched Jeremy direct the placement of their combined furniture, and had felt overwhelmed with love and gratitude for this life they were creating. "Where do you want the bookshelf?" Aaron had asked, carrying in one of Thomas's heavy wooden bookshelves. "Next to the couch," Jeremy had answered without hesitation. And Thomas had realized that Jeremy had been thinking about this, planning how their things would fit together in their new space. "You've been planning this layout, haven't you?" Thomas had asked later, as they collapsed on their new couch surrounded by boxes. "Maybe a little," Jeremy had admitted with a sheepish smile. "I wanted it to feel like home for both of us." "It already does," Thomas had said, and it had been true. Even with boxes everywhere and half their belongings still packed, the apartment had felt like theirs in a way that Thomas's old place never had. Their first night in the new apartment had been perfect in its simplicity. They had ordered takeout from their favorite Thai place and eaten it sitting on the floor of their new living room, surrounded by boxes but happy to be there together. "I have something for you," Jeremy had said after they had finished eating, reaching into one of the nearby boxes and pulling out a small wrapped package. "What is it?" Thomas had asked, accepting the gift with curiosity. "Open it and see." Thomas had unwrapped the package to find a small framed photo of the two of them from the previous weekend, taken by Jeremy's mother during a family barbecue. In the photo, they were sitting close together on a picnic bench, Jeremy's arm around Thomas's shoulders, both of them laughing at something off camera. They looked happy and comfortable and completely in love. "I thought we should have at least one picture of us in our new place," Jeremy had explained, "something that shows how happy we are." Thomas had felt tears prick at his eyes as he looked at the photo. "I love it. I love you." "I love you too," Jeremy had said, leaning over to kiss him softly. "Thank you for being patient with me while I figured all this out. Thank you for loving me even when I was too scared to love you back the way you deserved." "You were worth waiting for," Thomas had said, meaning every word. This was worth waiting for. Fall had brought new routines and deeper contentment. They had hosted their first dinner party in the new apartment, cooking together in their bigger kitchen and laughing with their friends around their dining table. Thomas had watched Jeremy tell a story to their guests, animated and happy, and had felt such a surge of love and pride that it had taken his breath away. "You okay?" Jeremy had asked later, as they cleaned up after their friends had gone home. "More than okay," Thomas had said. "I'm perfect. We're perfect." Jeremy had smiled, setting down the dish he had been drying and moving to wrap his arms around Thomas. "We really are, aren't we?" "Yeah," Thomas had said, leaning into Jeremy's embrace. "We really are." Winter had arrived with a sense of completeness and anticipation. They had been together for almost a year now, had been living together for 6 months, and Thomas had never been happier or more certain about anything in his life. Jeremy had grown into his identity with confidence and joy, no longer questioning whether his feelings were real or lasting, no longer afraid of what others might think. "I want to ask you something," Jeremy had said one evening in December, as they sat by their Christmas tree, a small but perfectly decorated evergreen that Jeremy had insisted they needed for their first Christmas in the new apartment. "What?" Thomas had asked, looking up from the book he had been reading. Jeremy had seemed nervous, fidgeting with the hem of his sweater in a way that was endearingly familiar. "I know we've only been together officially for a year, but it feels like longer. It feels like we've been building toward this our whole friendship." Thomas had set his book aside, giving Jeremy his full attention. "Building toward what?" "This," Jeremy had said, gesturing between them. "Us, this life we've created together. And I know it might be too soon, but I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else or with anyone else, ever." Thomas's heart had started to race as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. "Jeremy, I'm not asking you to marry me," Jeremy had said quickly, though his eyes were bright with emotion. "Not yet anyway, but I want you to know that's where I see this going. I want you to know that when I think about the future, about 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you're always there. You're always the person I want to come home to." Thomas had felt tears well up in his eyes, overwhelmed by the love and certainty in Jeremy's voice. "You're always there in my future too. You have been since sophomore year, even when I didn't think it was possible." Jeremy had smiled, reaching for Thomas's hands. "So we're on the same page then. We're building something permanent here." "We're building something permanent," Thomas had agreed, and Jeremy had kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. They had spent that Christmas with Jeremy's family, and Thomas had felt more than ever like he truly belonged there. Jeremy's mother had pulled him aside while they were cleaning up after dinner and told him how happy she was that Jeremy had found him, how much she loved seeing her son so content and confident. "He's different with you," she had said, drying dishes while Thomas washed. "More himself, if that makes sense, like he finally figured out who he was supposed to be." "I think we both did," Thomas had said, and she had smiled warmly. "That's the best kind of love," she had said, "when you bring out the best in each other." New Year's Eve had been quiet but perfect, just the two of them in their apartment, cooking dinner together and watching the ball drop on television. At midnight, Jeremy had kissed Thomas with such tenderness and love that Thomas had felt like his heart might burst from happiness. "Happy New Year," Jeremy had whispered against his lips. "Happy New Year," Thomas had whispered back, and he had meant it. This year, their second year together, felt full of possibility and promise. Spring had brought talk of the future in more concrete terms. They had started discussing marriage seriously, not as some distant possibility, but as something they both wanted and were ready for. Jeremy had been researching venues and photographers with an enthusiasm that had made Thomas laugh and fall even more in love with him. "What do you think about a summer wedding?" Jeremy had asked one evening in March, showing Thomas pictures on his laptop of outdoor venues with gardens and string lights. "I think that sounds perfect," Thomas had said, looking at the images of happy couples surrounded by flowers and fairy lights. "But are you sure you're ready for all this? Planning a wedding, dealing with everyone's opinions and expectations?" Jeremy had closed the laptop and turned to face Thomas fully. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life. I want to marry you, Thomas. I want everyone we know to see how much I love you, and I want to make promises to you in front of all our friends and family. I want it to be official and permanent and celebrated." Thomas had felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I want that too. I want all of that with you." "Then let's do it," Jeremy had said, grinning widely. "Let's plan a wedding." The engagement had happened 2 weeks later, not with a grand romantic gesture, but with a quiet conversation on their couch on a Tuesday evening. Jeremy had presented Thomas with a simple silver band and asked if he wanted to spend the rest of their lives together, and Thomas had said yes through happy tears before kissing his fiancée with all the love in his heart. "I can't believe we're engaged," Thomas had said later, admiring the ring on his finger. "I can," Jeremy had said confidently. "This feels like the most natural thing in the world. Like this is exactly where we were always supposed to end up." The wedding planning had been surprisingly fun, with both of them invested in creating a day that reflected their relationship and their journey together. They had chosen the outdoor venue Jeremy had shown him, with its garden setting and twinkling lights, and had decided on a small ceremony with just their closest friends and family. "I want Aaron to be my best man," Jeremy had said as they worked on their guest list. "He's the one who told me I was being an idiot for not seeing what was right in front of me." "That seems appropriate," Thomas had agreed. "I'm thinking of asking my brother to be mine." "Perfect," Jeremy had said, making notes on their planning sheet. "This is going to be amazing." Summer had arrived with a flurry of final wedding preparations and growing excitement. Their friends had thrown them a joint bachelor party that had been more like a celebration with everyone they loved, full of laughter and joy and toasts to their future together. "I can't believe you two are finally getting married," Sarah had said during her toast. "Ah, no toast." Tears in her eyes. "It feels like we've all been waiting for this for years." "We have been waiting for years," Aaron had added with a grin. These two were the most obvious couple in the world, and it took them forever to figure it out. Thomas had looked at Jeremy across the table, both of them laughing at their friends' teasing, and had felt such overwhelming gratitude for this life they had built, for these people who loved them, for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The wedding day had dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. Thomas had woken up in their apartment alone, since Jeremy had spent the night at his parents' house to maintain some semblance of tradition, and had felt a mixture of excitement and nerves that had made it hard to eat breakfast. His brother had arrived early to help him get ready, bringing coffee and bagels in a calming presence that Thomas had desperately needed. "You ready for this?" his brother had asked as Thomas adjusted his tie for the 10th time. "I've been ready for this for years," Thomas had said. And it had been true. All the nerves were just excitement in disguise, anticipation for the moment when he would get to see Jeremy and promise to love him forever in front of everyone who mattered to them. The venue had been transformed into something magical, with white chairs arranged in neat rows facing an arch covered in flowers, string lights hanging from the trees, and a sense of celebration in the air. Thomas had stood at the altar with Aaron beside him, watching their guests take their seats, and had felt his heart start to race with anticipation. The music had started, and Thomas had watched their friends and family walk down the aisle, but all he had been able to think about was Jeremy, about seeing Jeremy in his wedding suit, about the moment when they would finally be married. And then Jeremy had appeared at the end of the aisle, looking handsome and nervous and so full of love that Thomas had felt tears prick at his eyes immediately. Jeremy had walked toward him with a smile that had been just for Thomas, and when he had reached the altar and taken Thomas's hands, everything else had faded away. "Hi," Jeremy had whispered, just for him. "Hi," Thomas had whispered back, squeezing Jeremy's hands. The ceremony had been perfect, full of personal touches and meaningful words. They had written their own vows, promises that had made their guests laugh and cry, and had captured exactly what they meant to each other. "Thomas," Jeremy had said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "you taught me what real love looks like. You showed me that the right person doesn't just accept who you are. They help you become who you're meant to be. You waited for me to figure myself out, and then you loved me through all the fear and uncertainty that came with it. I promise to love you with the same patience and understanding for the rest of our lives." Thomas had barely been able to get through his own vows, overwhelmed by emotion and love. "Jeremy, you changed my life the day I met you, even though it took us years to figure out what that meant. You made me believe that the kind of love I had dreamed about was real and possible and worth waiting for. I promise to love you exactly as you are and to grow and change with you as we build our life together." When the officiant had pronounced them married and told them they could kiss, Jeremy had cupped Thomas's face in his hands and kissed him with such joy and love that Thomas had felt like his heart might burst. The applause from their guests had seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the sound of his own heartbeat and Jeremy's soft laughter against his lips. The reception had been a blur of congratulations and dancing and toasts from their friends and family. Thomas had felt like he was floating through it all, anchored only by Jeremy's hand in his and the ring on his finger that marked him as married, as permanently and officially Jeremy's. "How does it feel to be married?" Jeremy's mother had asked during their mother-son dance, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "It feels perfect," Jeremy had said, looking over at Thomas, who was dancing with his own mother nearby. "It feels like everything finally makes sense." Later that evening, after all their guests had gone home and they had returned to their apartment, Thomas and Jeremy had sat on their couch in their wedding clothes, still wearing their rings and glowing with happiness. "We did it," Jeremy had said, taking Thomas's hand and intertwining their fingers. "We're married." "We're married," Thomas had repeated, still marveling at the words. "How does it feel?" "It feels like the most natural thing in the world," Jeremy had said, echoing what he had said when they got engaged. "Like this is exactly where we were always supposed to end up." Thomas had leaned against Jeremy's shoulder, feeling overwhelmed with contentment and love. "I keep thinking about that night in December when you first told me you thought you might be falling in love with your best friend. Did you know then, Sinan, that this is where we'd end up?" Jeremy had been quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I hoped," he had said finally. "I hoped so much that it scared me. But I don't think I really believed it was possible until you told me you'd been feeling the same way." "I believed it," Thomas had said softly, "even when I was terrified and convinced you could never feel the same way. Some part of me always believed that this was possible, that we were possible." "And now here we are," Jeremy had said, pressing a kiss to the top of Thomas's head. "Married and happy and exactly where we belong." "Exactly where we belong," Thomas had agreed. They had sat there in comfortable silence for a while, processing the day and the magnitude of what they had just committed to. Finally, Jeremy had spoken again. I have one more thing for you, he had said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small envelope. What is it? Thomas had asked, accepting the envelope with curiosity. Open it and see. Inside the envelope had been a handwritten letter, and Thomas had recognized Jeremy's careful handwriting immediately. He had unfolded the letter and begun to read. My dearest Thomas, the letter had begun, by the time you read this, we'll be married, and I'll finally be able to call you my husband. I wanted to write this down because there are things I need you to know, things I want you to remember on the days when life gets difficult or when we face challenges together. First, I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. Not because it was easy, but because it taught me who I really am and what I'm capable of. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and you loved me enough to wait while I figured it out. Second, I want you to know that every day I wake up, grateful that you chose to love me, even when I was too scared to love you back the way you deserved. Your patience and understanding changed my life, and I will spend the rest of our marriage trying to love you with the same generosity and grace. Finally, I want you to know that when I think about our future, I don't just see happiness and success and all the things we hope for. I also see challenges and change and moments when we'll have to choose each other over and over again. And I want you to know that I'm ready for all of it because there's no one I'd rather face the unknown with than you. Thank you for being my best friend, my partner, and now my husband. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like. I can't wait to spend the rest of our lives discovering what comes next. All my love, always and forever, Jeremy, Thomas had finished reading, with tears streaming down his cheeks, overwhelmed by the love and thoughtfulness in Jeremy's words. This is beautiful, he had managed to say through his tears. This is perfect. I wanted you to have something to keep, Jeremy had said, his own eyes bright with emotion. Something that captures how I feel about you and about us. I love you so much, Thomas had said, setting the letter aside carefully and turning to kiss Jeremy with all the love in his heart. I love you so much it sometimes scares me. I love you too, Jeremy had said against his lips, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. They had made love that night as husbands for the first time, tender and passionate and full of promises for the future. Afterward, they had lain tangled together in their bed, talking softly about the day and their hopes for their marriage. Do you think we'll always be this happy? Thomas had asked, tracing patterns on Jeremy's chest with his fingertips. I think we'll have moments of happiness like this, Jeremy had said thoughtfully. And I think we'll have difficult moments too, but I think as long as we keep choosing each other, as long as we keep talking to each other the way we did tonight, we'll be okay. I'll always choose you, Thomas had promised, no matter what comes. And I'll always choose you, Jeremy had promised back. That's what marriage means, right? Choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, Thomas had agreed, and Jeremy had kissed him again, soft and sweet and full of forever. As Thomas had drifted off to sleep that night, Jeremy's arms around him and their wedding rings catching the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. He had felt a sense of completeness and peace that he had never experienced before. This was what he had been waiting for his whole life, this love and partnership and sense of home that he had found with Jeremy. And now, 6 months later, sitting in their favorite coffee shop, as Jeremy asked him about the nature of real love, Thomas could see that same contentment and certainty in Jeremy's eyes. The questions weren't born from confusion or uncertainty anymore, but from a deep desire to understand and articulate the love they had found together. Real love, Thomas said now, meeting Jeremy's gaze across the small table, is when you can't imagine your life without someone, even when they're sitting right across from you, asking philosophical questions about love. Jeremy laughed, reaching across the table to take Thomas's hand. Is that your way of telling me I ask too many questions? It's my way of telling you that I love your questions, Thomas said, squeezing Jeremy's hand. I love that you still want to understand what we have, even though we're living it every day. I think I'll always want to understand it better, Jeremy said softly, because what we have feels so important, so precious, that I want to make sure I'm doing it justice. You are, Thomas assured him, bringing Jeremy's hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. We both are. We're doing this exactly right. Jeremy smiled, that same smile that had made Thomas's heart race for years, and Thomas felt the familiar flutter of love and gratitude in his chest. They had come so far from that night when Jeremy had first asked him about love, when they had both been too scared to admit what they were feeling. Now they were married, building a life together, secure in their love and commitment to each other. "Come on," Jeremy said, standing and pulling Thomas up with him. "Let's go home. I want to show you how much I love you." "You show me every day," Thomas said, but he followed Jeremy out of the coffee shop and toward their car, toward their apartment, toward the life they had built together through patience and courage and the kind of love that really did feel like coming home. As they walked hand in hand down the familiar street, Thomas thought about all the moments that had led them here, all the questions and conversations and small acts of bravery that had brought them from friendship to love to marriage. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment of fear and uncertainty because it had led them to this, to each other, to a love that was real and lasting and exactly what they had both been searching for all along. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories, Thomas thought, as Jeremy squeezed his hand and smiled at him in the golden afternoon light, are the ones that start with a simple question and end with a lifetime of answers discovered together.